For us to find any hope in the future, we all got to go backwards first and get in touch with our past. Then come forward, instead of with fear of the future, we come back with pride and a warm understanding. The biggest thing to get over is that it's always easier to think that the grass is greener on the other side.
I'm going to tell you about my life, and I want you to know that the worst, this is the secret to life, el secreto de la vida es este, que lo peor, the worst can become the best if you don't get bitter, if you don't fall apart and start listening to gossip. You can stand up a weed that you give a lot of support to, a lot of free stuff like a rose, and you give it fertilizer and you give it this, what happens? A big wind comes or stormy and it dies. But weeds, hierbas, what do? You don't do nothing to them. They break the concrete. That's who we are.
When I started my parents' story, I thought that the story of the people down the street was a better story. And the story over there was a better story. And I didn't think much of my own parents. My father was always teasing and always had this kind of wild thing. He told me to start, just before I started kindergarten, he told me that everybody in the world was Mexican. And he said, and if they're not, they want to be. That wasn't quite the way it happened. It happened with a little kid. I'll never forget it. His name was Howard. And he was a redheaded kid with a lot of freckles. And it happened, 40 years ago, and it still hurts. I mean, to remember it. It just, these things never leave you. He said, "Are you Mexican?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Mexican." And when I said that, he started crying and screaming. And he screamed, "You got a knife." I said, "Howard, I don't got a knife." And he said, "Oh, yes, you do."
So then I catch him at the end of the playground and I say, "I don't got a knife." He said, "Oh, yes, you do." I said, "No, really, I don't got a knife." He said, "My parents told me Mexicans always got knives." I said, "I didn't know that. I'll bring one tomorrow." So I brought a little tiny knife, but the funny thing about it was I found it in my father's drawer. It was so rusty I couldn't open it. It was about this big, but I had a knife. I wanted to be a Mexican. So anyhow, then later on that week, I still want to be friends with Howard. We like each other. Something about it. We like each other. So I invited him over to the ranch. I said, "Come over to the ranch and I'll show you how to ride a horse or a bucking pig." And he said, "I can't. I talked it over with my parents and I can't be around you anymore. I can't talk to you anymore." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because Mexicans are bad people, so I can't be around you." And you know what I said? I said, "Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry." That concluded my American education. Because, watch this, education is not just what you learn in the books. Listen, this is important. Education is what you learn about yourself so you have a story that you carry your life through.
Like some of the stories my father would tell me, like that there was a big serpent, a big snake that had eaten kids in the village. Everyone was terrified about it. And his father, a great horseman, the serpent came at him on horseback, stood up 8 feet tall and came at him. And he took a tree branch, broke it off, and fought with the serpent, rammed it into his mouth, and then roped it and dragged it. It was like St. George, the dragon in Europe. And I thought those were all legends. And my father says, "No, it's true." But then I'm at San Diego Zoo, and I go to the man who's ever studies snakeology or whatever, and and I ask him, I hear that there's a snake can stand up 8 feet tall and would attack a man on horseback. Is that possible? And he says, "Oh yeah, that's the Bushmaster." And I said, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, if they're 14 feet long, they stand up 7 feet, half their length. And if they're 16, they stand up 8. And they look around like this." And he said, they were fearless. That's why they're basically extinct. They would attack a train, an automobile. So sure, they attack a man on horseback. And I said, "Oh my God, I am the doubting Thomas." But when I went to Mexico, I was 19 years old. It just opened up my eyes to the music, to the culture, the Indians. and then I could see Indian cultures thousands of years before Columbus, and then I saw Indian mothers nursing their young and taking care of all the rich colors and the food and all of a sudden I said, oh my God, I come from somebody, from somewhere. And then the next thing is, I am somebody. And then as soon as I realized I come from somewhere and I am somebody, it's like a great peace happens in your stomach. And then I started crying. I remember I just was crying and crying. And then I started understanding my parents were good people, you know, and I'd been mad at them all this year. They hadn't lied to me.
And I want to tell you here that to end this conversation, that there are no bad people on earth anywhere. We're all one family. If my writing had existed then, Howard's mother in Boston would have bought my books because they got great review in the New York Times and the Boston paper, and she would have read my books as they drove across the country. And by the time they got to California, she would have said, Howard, if you run across any Mexican kids, invite them over to the house. Mexicans are good people. That's the truth. We're all good people all over the world. Each one of you is a walking star full of power, poder. Thank you.